Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Torrey. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council in Hartford, Connecticut. We are a small but mighty, globally engaged state. So as of today, both of our United States senators would have addressed the World Affairs Councils of America conference. And you may remember a few years ago, we had Senator Blumenthal, and we're so lucky to have Senator Murphy here with us today. So many of you know that our Hartford Council is one of 3 councils out of the 90 councils. So we have, of course, us in Hartford, New London, and Stamford. So during the conference, we've been hearing a lot about what policies we might be able to expect from the next administration. And today we have a really good opportunity to hear from one of our lawmakers. And he'll be in conversation with our own Bill Clifford. Senator Murphy has emerged as one of the next generation of foreign policy leaders in the Senate. He serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Appropriations, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. He's a former chairman of the European Subcommittee and currently ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee. Last year, he published a foreign affairs article with Senators Heinrich and Schatz outlining the principles of a progressive foreign policy. As both an ally and critic of the Obama administration, Senator Murphy has been a long defender of the Iran nuclear deal and American diplomatic leadership, skeptical of direct U.S. military engagement in the Syrian civil war, an advocate for refugees and human rights, and proponent of a robust foreign assistance and national security budget. And I have to say that all of you know how important it is for our communities to have a strong advocate here in Washington. And I'm so proud to say that Senator Murphy is that for us in Connecticut. He's proved time and time again that he stands with the people of our state. And in this contentious atmosphere in Washington, he's often reached across the aisle to work with his colleagues, including his trips to Ukraine with Senator John McCain, appearing in many joint programs following, both here in Washington and in our state. And I was reminded by my colleague, Kay Maxwell, the other day of the powerful letter he wrote to constituents the day after the election, which I know Kay has shared with her friends and networks all around the country, and I encourage everyone to look at that. And from our World Affairs Council perspective, Senator Murphy is always there when we call him, whether it's to help us with an event or to speak to our Model UN students. And I'll take this opportunity to remind Senator Murphy that our Model UN is in 2 weeks from today. So ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute honor for me to welcome Senator Murphy to us this morning.
Coming up.
Good morning. Megan, thank you very much, and thank you for actually connecting us with Senator Murphy's office so we could have this conversation. Senator, thanks for being here. We did try, as you may know, to also secure a Republican from the Senate. However, on Friday, many members leave, and actually I'm told that a number of Republicans do not want to speak yet about Donald Trump's presidency. So we're here with one partisan. I'm glad Megan mentioned that you are both, we're both an ally and critic of the Obama administration. So I'd like to start by asking you, how would you assess President Obama's foreign policy record, both in terms of, some see virtue in restraint. Other critics would say it's been a weak foreign policy. What's your view?
Well, first, Bill, thank you for having me. Megan, thank you for being such a strong force and presence in Connecticut. We're really lucky that we do have 3 very strong councils in Connecticut, and a lot of active members, so it's fantastic to be with you here this morning. So I'm certainly a subscriber to the notion of the Obama doctrine, that Jeff Goldberg coined in his piece for The Atlantic, and I think President Obama has been right to learn the lessons of mistake and misadventure in Iraq and Afghanistan and to pursue this policy of restraint. But it's a policy of military restraint, and I think that that's what often gets confused. The idea that we are no longer invading countries doesn't mean that we aren't in many ways more forward deployed in the world than we ever have before. The idea that we could marshal together the strength of nations all across the world to apply pressure to Iran such that they would give up their nuclear ambitions, the idea that we could bring together countries of diverse economic backgrounds to sign a historic climate change agreement that probably will do more for national security than, for this country over the course of the next 20 years than any invasion of a nation could. Those are examples of where good old-fashioned diplomacy ended up making this country stronger and safer in a way that military efforts, at least over the course of the past 50 years, have not. So I totally reject this idea that when America isn't sending its troops into battle against bad guys, that we are weak. In fact, there's plenty of examples on how this country has become safer. Now, I certainly have parted ways with the administration when I see them deviating from that philosophy. And there is enormous pressure on the administration to meet some of the challenges that we face, especially in the Middle East with military force. And so I have been the loudest critic of the administration when it came to his proposal to bomb Syria in the wake of the chemical weapons allegations. I am currently the loudest critic of the support for the Saudi coalition's bombing campaign in Yemen. I just see absolutely no evidence that over the long term, U.S. military engagement in the Middle East leads to political stability. In fact, I think all of the evidence points to the exact opposite, that robust U.S. military engagement in the Middle East, well, perhaps putting a temporary salve on wounds, perhaps making us feel better that we're doing something, and something big and kinetic, in the end makes things worse, not better. And so I certainly have parted ways, but I think that that's on probably 10% of the agenda, 90% of the agenda. I've been one of his strongest backers.
Well, it sounds like you're going to maintain that position vis-a-vis Mr. Trump, because during the campaign he actually called for a stepped-up military campaign with respect to Syria, and that he would remove generals who were not sufficiently combative.
Well, we just don't know. I mean, there's a black box right now in the Trump transition team when it comes to foreign policy, and we don't know what's in it, and we're not sure that they know what's in it. But he seemed to say two different things during the campaign. He obviously went out of his way to try to convince people that he had been an opponent of the Iraq War, which, the only reason you do that, I think, is to sort of signal that you are not going to make those kind of mistakes in the future. And he didn't really sketch out exactly what he was going to do to combat ISIL, other than these tremendously divisive domestic tactics of banning Muslims. So we'll see. I mean, certainly everybody who's been mentioned so far for the Secretary of State position, and to an extent for the Department of Defense, have been fairly traditional neoconservatives, more hawkish figures. But we're all going to have to wait to see what's in this secret plan.
His unsecret words during the campaign were America first, and that has certainly unnerved a great many foreign capitals. His notion of, I can fix things, meaning I personally can fix things, dovetails with a more go-it-alone approach in the world. What do you think alliance politics will look like? And by the way, how does that sit in the Senate?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm going to have to beg off some of these questions. I mean that with all due respect. I mean, we are 9 days from the election. It would be pretty foolish for me to sit here and try to tell you what I think is coming from a Trump administration's foreign policy. We don't know, and there's only downside for me to predict something that will be, proved completely wrong 30, 60 days from now.
It's all right, we've all been wrong.
I know, yeah. So I don't know what what alliance politics look like. I certainly know there are a lot of people trying to convince him of the wisdom of NATO. He certainly seems to be trying to retreat from some of the things he said about walking away from our treaty commitments in Asia and the things he had said about forcing the Koreans and the Japanese to start pursuing nuclear weapons programs. And back to this idea that part of America First is banning certain sets of individuals based on their religion from this country. Listen, there's nothing that could make us less safe. I mean, there's no bigger mistake we could make than walk away from our history of diversity and tolerance and inclusive communities. And the one lesson that we have learned from Europe is they have struggled to contain these extremist movements in Brussels and in Paris is that in communities where you make Muslims feel like they are not part of the whole, when you push them off into distinct neighborhoods and community settings, that starts to allow for these voices, these extremist voices, to take root. And so, I've heard some tremendously disturbing things coming from surrogates of the administration in the past few days, talking about registries and internment camps, and that's not going to happen. The United States Senate, Republicans and Democrats won't allow that to happen, but just the continued talk it continues to provide bulletin board material for the very people that we're fighting against. And listen, I think there's going to be a tremendous education for him, and I hope that he has some very smart Republicans, conservatives, even neoconservatives, telling him that this kind of talk about registries and bans, that'll get a lot of people killed really quick.
Well, and in addition to talk, there's been some correlation between incidents like terrorist attacks in Paris, and then there's the echo effect of some bombing in the U.S. or shooting. And as you all too well know from Sandy Hook, there are these lone wolf copycats. Anti-Muslim hate crimes rose dramatically this past year, according to the FBI, up 67% to more than 250 incidents in the country. What can we do to keep that to get that number back down? Yeah.
Well, in one of my post-election statements, I talked about the fact that, while we have to press on this next administration to get rid of all of this anti-Muslim bias and all of these, very dangerous programs that they've proposed, we also have to recognize that ultimately we might not be able to wait for this administration to help us build inclusive communities, that it's up to us. And we frankly have a lot to say in our neighborhood, in our school, in our town, and in our state. I mean, let's be honest, the number has jumped in the last year, but if you really chart the track line of Islamophobia in this country, it started in 2008. I mean, to President Bush's credit, right, he came out immediately after the attacks on September 11th and made it clear that this was not going to be a war of Christians against Muslims. And he did a lot during those 8 years to sort of tamp down even on sort of his party's instincts sometimes to turn this into a religious war. The lid came off when President Obama was elected, and it came off in a spectacular way. I mean, I'd point you to some really good work that's been done on the last 8 years of Islamophobic activity in this country. It is organized and well-funded, right? This isn't just, Sharia law bills don't pop up in state legislatures just because some, second-term state legislator, has an idea in his head sitting in his living room. There is a well-funded campaign in this country, funded by a handful of groups, funded by a handful of big donors that have promoted bans on mosques, bans on Sharia law, campaigns against the Learning Channel when they try to put a show about Muslims, a reality show about Muslims on TV, calling on anybody who advertises with the Learning Channel to cancel their subscriptions or their purchases. So, this is up to us ultimately at a local level as much as it's up to us at a national level.
Let's go to something really concrete that's at play right now. The Iran nuclear deal was one of the most divisive acts of Obama's legacy, what could be his legacy, and the Iran Sanctions Act is coming up by the end of this year. The House has approved a measure that I guess just extends the sanctions measures, but you have competing legislation and proposals in the Senate. Where do you see it coming out?
Well, the House version of the bill does a straightforward extension with no additional sanctions, and that actually mirrors a piece of legislation that Tim Kaine and I introduced together earlier this year in the spring. So I'm hopeful, and frankly I expect that we will pass either the House bill or a version of it to do a straightforward extension of the Iran Sanctions Act. I think Tim and I both thought that this was important to continue the authorization that the president has to reimpose sanctions. The president has the ability to reimpose them. He's granted these waivers for the time being. But I think it's an important signal to the Iranians that, if they violate the deal, Congress is still willing to give the power to the president. What many of us worried is that we were going to extend the existing sanctions and layer on a whole new set of sanctions that may or may not be in violation of the letter or the spirit of the agreement. I don't expect that that's what's going to happen. I think we'll do a straightforward extension.
That's where Senator Corker's going, though.
Yeah, that's where Senator Corker's going. And I think we'll have that fight next year. I mean, I think my guess is what will happen is that we will pass a straightforward extension, so the baseline will continue, and then you'll likely get an introduction of additional sanctions by some subset of Republicans, perhaps Republicans and Democrats, next year.
What would be the consequence, in your mind, if additional sanctions went on for bringing in this, sanctions on ballistic missile tests? If that did go through, how would Iran react, in your view? I know it's hypothetical. But.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical, and it's obviously dependent on what the scope of the sanctions were. Obviously, we've already taken sanction steps, right? The administration has already responded to the ballistic missile test, and there are some that don't think that's sufficient. I tend to believe that the administration's response there was right-sized. I mean, listen, all of us, well, let me not say all of us, I voted for the Sanctions Act with the explicit caveat that I was withholding and reserving the right to vote for additional non-nuclear sanctions should Iran continue to support terrorism, continue to run a ballistic missile program in violation of the United Nations. And so I'm not going to tell you that I won't vote for additional sanctions against Iran if I think that they continue to violate UN law, or they continue to support our enemies. The worry is that many Republicans are going to use those sanctions not really to send a message about the ballistic missile program, but to try to push Iran to walk away from the agreement, meaning they're going to support sanctions that are frankly disproportional to the need relative to the violation on some non-nuclear activity. And I'll watch that very carefully. That's certainly not my intention. But if we pass sanctions against Iran, let's say we find some new evidence that they're funding some very, very bad people in new ways, and we sanction them, and they walk away from the Iran deal because of it, that's their fault, not my fault, not our fault, right? We signed a nuclear agreement with them. That didn't bind us against sanctioning them for other activity. They know that, and we know that.
Our conference these past 3 days, Senator Murphy, has focused on a lot of issues ranging from transatlantic security and the future of the West to trade and our global economy. One thing I'd like to ask before throwing it out to my colleagues around the country is Russia, and specifically not so much what's happening in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Europe, but the accusation from the Director of National Intelligence that senior Russian officials hacked Democratic Party websites. What's your sense of what really happened there, and what's the response?
Well, there's no question what happened here. I mean, maybe accusation is the right word, but that's frankly the word that I don't mean to be harsh, but that's the word. But that's the word that the Russians use as an accusation, right? Like, it happened, right? The Russians conducted a hacking operation to influence an American election, and they were successful, right? That is a scandal of epic proportions, and it should frankly lead every single conversation that we have about foreign policy in this country, right? the fact that, that this is becoming a partisan issue, the fact that it may be that the party in power, having accrued the benefit of Russian interference in our election, is going to try to sweep this under the rug, is the biggest foreign policy scandal in this country in decades. Now, maybe I'm overblowing this, and Bob Corker is going to lead a set of hearings next year to uncover what happened, to make it clear to the American public that the Russians attempted to influence our elections, attempted to tap into our voter rolls, right, into our voter lists, to, to take away your right to vote. But I'm worried. I'm worried that this
By
is
the way, with some indirect or even direct encouragement from a candidate.
Right. I mean, so I worry.
So if this were to happen in a re-election, it would be almost Watergate-like.
Yeah, and listen, Marco Rubio is, Marco Rubio made a very sort of obvious comment during his re-election campaign, which was, don't think that the Russians are Republicans, right? They're not, right? The Russians are for themselves, and they believed, rightly so, that Donald Trump was their candidate. But 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, or 12 years from now, Republicans shouldn't think that it's going to be all of their emails that are going to be put onto the web. 2 years from now, a year from now, it could be Republicans whose emails are put out into public circulation by the Russians. So, there, by the grace of God, it's not you today. And I hope this is going to be a focus of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, upon which I sit at the beginning of next year. And if it isn't, God help us all.
There you have it. I think there's some mics that are there, and we'll go to questions. Please identify yourself and your counsel.
Good morning. I'm Melanie Fury from the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and I want to thank you, Senator, for your comments this morning. And I wonder where you see this more moderate stance on looking at the world and our foreign policy in the next 4 years, and what role does the Senate have in keeping us on an even keel?
So it was referenced in my introduction that I did a piece in foreign policy maybe a year or more ago with two other new young senators, where we unveiled some broad principles of what we called progressive foreign policy. And the idea is that there is a different way to be internationalist, and maybe this ratio of 20-to-1 on military spending to non-military spending doesn't make sense any longer, especially in a world in which the threats posed to this country are increasingly non-military, right? And we just talked about one of those threats being cybersecurity. There's energy security, there's cybersecurity, there's information security, there's threats with respect to propaganda and corruption and bribery and graft. And we are very well resourced to confront Russia if they roll tanks across the Fulda Gap. We are not very well resourced today to try to stop them from bullying their neighbors with gas and oil pipelines. We are not well resourced to try to stop them from simply paying off politicians and elected officials in countries throughout their periphery. We are not well resourced to try to set the record straight with all of the propaganda that is sent throughout the region by them. And so, later this year, I'm going to try to unveil what I would sort of call an alternative budget for international affairs, to suggest all of the tools that we have vastly under-resourced that would frankly make us a lot more safe than some of the weapons programs that we continue to fund. And I'm not somebody who says you have to steal from defense to fund these things. I actually think you continue to have to rebuild our Navy, and we have real conventional threats, so continue to spend robustly on the military, but recognize that we need to spend other places as well. The question of where does this go? I mean, again, that's an open question. There were certain things that Trump said during the campaign that would suggest he might be willing to listen to that. Some of the names that have been proffered suggest that Republicans are going to go back to their old school ways. There's certainly advocates, somebody like Lindsey Graham, for instance, who is certainly a hawk also understands that the State Department, the USAID, and the Broadcast Board of Governors, all of those places are vastly, vastly under-resourced. So we do have allies on the Republican side here. It just remains to be seen whether there's going to be anybody in the administration that's going to really hear that case.
Yes, hi, I'm Ed Martins from World Boston. Senator, I'd like to go back a little bit. You were talking about, and I now, after you spoke, I agree with you. It's a huge scandal that the Russians basically hacked our election. What steps is being taken towards cybersecurity? I mean, my knowledge of computers is limited. I can look up the Red Sox score, but that's about it. But you know, I read these horror stories that they could, you know, shut down the power grid in, you know, New England or, you know, Southern California or something, you know, open up dam gates. I mean, you know, what steps are we taking to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. So,
Don't do that. We need
no,
him.
I mean, listen, there's, so I can tell you that the administration takes this very seriously. I can tell you that that there are serious steps being taken to shore up the security of our grid, to shore up the security of government information pipelines. I can tell you that every single Senate office has changed their practices in the wake of these disclosures and allegations. I can frankly just tell you that there's a lot less that happens on computers that used to happen before, right? I mean, we're sort of going back to, you know, one-on-one, yeah, sort of old-fashioned one-on-one conversations for a lot of things. So, you know, I can tell you that a lot is happening. I think the danger is that we need to build a tighter private-public sector partnership here, and the tension has existed when private companies are told by the government that they need to have a more open flow of information to the government about threats that they receive. And often private companies have not wanted to be part of legislation that creates that more open flow because they think that the government sort of will take trade secrets, won't be careful about their data. But the one missing link here is having a more real-time conversation between, you know, an energy company that's running a nuclear power plant that sees a threat from the Chinese. They've got to communicate that immediately to somebody that has the full spectrum of sight lines into energy generation at FERC or wherever, and that's where we're a little bit slow right now.
Yes, and then we'll go to Volker.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. I'm interested in the environment, and I think a lot of what we're hearing out of the Trump administration is concerning for some of us, for many of us, I suspect. And I'm wondering what you would say to ordinary citizens. How do you want us to communicate with our congressmen, our senators? How can we, as ordinary citizens, make our views known about things such as the environment?
There's so many different ways to talk about this, right? I mean, listen, this is a meteor heading for the Earth, and we are in the last days of being able to destroy this thing before its trajectory is unavoidable. Stephen Hawking, right, came out the other day and said we've got 1,000 years left before we have to find another planet. You know, this is as serious as it gets, and the time that we have is shrinking. So I would just sort of gauge your friend and pick which argument you think makes the most sense to them, because you clearly have an argument about the future and the salvation of this planet, and we can give you all the ways to make that argument. We've got a clear economic argument, right? There are going to be millions of jobs in renewable energy in this world over the course of the next 20 years, and they will accrue to the country that creates the domestic market for it. So today, you know, a lot of Americans are surprised to know, because we're so proud of the technology and the innovation that happens in the United States. Of the top 10 solar companies in the world, the United States has one. Of the top 10 wind turbine companies in the world, the United States has one. Of the top 10 advanced battery companies in the world, the United States has two. Right? Innovation in renewable energy is not happening in the United States. Why? Because we're not buying it. Because the Chinese, the Koreans, the Germans are buying it, not us. And third, if your friend cares about national security, walk him through the real story of Syria, right? The real story of Syria involves a massive long-term drought that forced individuals off of their farms into the cities, crowding the cities to an extent that there weren't enough jobs, that there was tremendous unprecedented economic dislocation that turned into political dislocation. I'm not telling you that they also happen to be living under a brutal, vicious dictator. So I'm not saying that the story in Syria or the story in Mali is only a story of global warming, but a major contributor to the unrest that we are seeing in very hot portions of the globe, which tend to be the place with huge youth bulges and the existence of vicious extremist groups. Some of that story, a lot of that story has to do with climate change. So, pick your poison. There are a bunch of different ways to talk about the imperative here. Here's my only caveat of good news here. The Obama administration made so much important progress on climate change that there's some of it, I think, that is irreversible. The new auto emission standards, which are making our vehicles 40% more efficient, that probably isn't going to get reversed just because the cost to companies to take all the technology out of cars probably is too big. We've extended on a long-term basis the renewable energy tax credits for wind and solar, and they've already proven to be enormously successful. At the first quarter of 2016, almost 100% of new power generation in this country came from wind turbines and solar panels, right? No coal plants, no oil plants, not even any gas plants being built. And I can argue that we should probably have a few new gas plants and a few new nuclear plants, but 100% of the new power generation in this country first quarter of this year was renewable. So some of that stuff is baked in, and no matter what Trump does on the Paris Agreement, no matter what he does on the Clean Power Plant rule, there's some of the good stuff that probably isn't going away.
Good time to go to Miami.
Yeah, Miami as the crossroads of international relations. Yes, my name is Volker Anding from Miami. The campaign slogan, America First, and Mr. Trump's comments on NATO and other related aspects has a very strong isolationist ring to me. What happened to the notion of the indispensable nation, which in my understanding is that United States has been very effectively and for a long time the leader of the free world?
Well, I don't know. I think those are two different thoughts, right? I mean, I would first say on this idea of isolationism, there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States Senate that the United States should guard against isolationism and that we can be a force for good in the world. And so, again, I think the jury is out on which way Trump is going to go here. But you have a majority of both parties in the Senate and the House that will likely resist big moves towards isolationism, like, for instance, withdrawing from NATO. At the same time, I'd push back on this idea that we are the indispensable nation. I think we have a history of suffering from some pretty dangerous hubris in this country, thinking that we can solve every problem in the world. We tend to largely think that we can solve those problems through military intervention, and I think we're living it today in Syria. So I agree that there is, probably no big problem in the world that doesn't have an element of its solution that involves the United States. But I think some of the biggest mistakes we have made is when we tell ourselves that we are indispensable and that without us a problem can't be solved. I think in the Middle East today, I'd argue that the problems there will get solved more quickly with less American intervention, with less American hubris, and with less belief that we are indispensable to fixing all the problems of that region.
Are there students? Students with questions? Let's go to Professor.
Senator Scott Forster from Colorado Springs, thanks for being here. One of the questions that ran through the campaign, a lot of the transition talk, is the prospect of conflicts of interest between private business interests, not only of the Trump family, but also of some of the folks in and around that. I mean, the Congress has a lot to say about that with respect to laws and ethics rules and how we divide that line. I'm not naive enough to think you could separate it entirely, but I'd appreciate your perspective on what is the proper balance to be struck here.
Well, I don't think it's a balance at all. You know, I think we should expect that individuals serving in the cabinet, individuals serving at the Department of State, Department of Defense have no conflicts of interest, that there is no potential that they or their family are going to receive monetary gain from the decisions that they make. Now, I understand that seems like a very naive thing to say when we've just elected a president who's got a vast real estate empire, and there are discussions undergoing as to whether the individuals who are going to be running that empire are going to actually also be inside the government. But you're right, the Congress has a lot to say about this because we ultimately approve everyone that is going to be picked for positions in this administration, with the exception of close advisors in and around the president at the White House. A lot of this will be a decision for Republicans, frankly. You know, if there's an individual who has a massive conflict of interest or has had a history of massive conflicts of interest, R.E. Rudy Giuliani, for instance, you know, I don't think there's going to be a single Democrat who's going to support them, and I think we will rise up and talk about the problem of these conflicts. It'll be a decision for Republicans as to whether they think this is as important an issue as we will think it is, and we'll be trying to convince them to join us and say to the administration, you know, listen, make this a test of the individuals that you put up for these important positions. I think it's incredibly important. I think there's all sorts of reason to be greatly worried that it's not a priority for this administration, but it'll be us in the Senate who will have something to say about it.
I'm coming to you next. Just gotta vary it.
Hi, I'm Mary Mendoza. I'm from World Boston. The conflict of interest laws that you just recently mentioned specifically exclude the president and the vice president from being included in that. Is there any sort of move in Congress to create new laws to say, nope, you can't enrich yourself?
Again, you know, we're sitting here 9 days out, right? So, you know, excuse me, no, there's not any move today to do that. You know, I think a lot of us are sitting and waiting. We're going to watch who he brings into the administration. We're going to watch, you know, what his first set of priorities are. But we're just not there yet. And I don't mean to suggest that I'm not, or others are not taking this seriously, but we know 4 people so far out of 4,000 that have been proposed for the new administration. We have no signal on what his first set of policies or introduced legislation are going to be. So I think we're worried about it, but I think it's too early for us to be throwing in legislation. I think we give him a chance to make his appointments, to tell us what legislation he wants, what policies he wants to pursue, and then we calibrate from there. It's a concern, but it's a little premature for us to be jumping into that.
Although he has talked about infrastructure, and the Republicans have talked about tax cuts. So are we on the cusp of some tax cut and spend phenomenon, and can we afford it?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, this is a fairly, you know, at some level innovative infrastructure plan that he's laid out in a very skeletal position paper, but also familiar in that it looks like deficit spending. It looks like old supply side economics in which we're going to cut some taxes and just suggest that the money will come in the back door. Interesting, he's now using supply side, I don't know what you'd call it, but he's sort of using supply side spending, where he's saying that if you spend a bunch of money, you will accrue a bunch of tax revenue in to pay for it, which, you know, that idea is much more attractive to Democrats, frankly, right? But it's a bet on either side. Cutting taxes eventually raises you money, or spending money eventually raises you money. You'll have a lot of people who want to engage in a conversation about big infrastructure spending.
It'd be good to see if you can get along from the start.
Yeah, you know, but what he's outlined right now doesn't necessarily seem like it does what he says it does. I mean, he's talking about spending $140 billion to get $1 trillion, and I think that's probably a little optimistic.
Question here. and then there, and then there. 1, 2, 3. And I think that might be...
In the past, there's been so many votes along partisan lines in the Senate. You know what the vote's going to be before the issue comes up. With so many Republicans having opposed or not endorsed Donald Trump, do you see a hope for a coalition of moderate Republicans and Democrats getting together and opposing his more outrageous appointments and ideas?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this guy's, he's much more a Republican than a Democrat, but he's something new, and so you can potentially see a new political order in which, everything is scrambled, and you have, coalitions of Republicans and Democrats that sort of come together and come apart and come back together that are supporting him on certain policies, right? On infrastructure, you'll have, Democrats and moderate Republicans supporting a plan that Tea Party Republicans are against on a Muslim internment proposal, right? You would have different sets of groups coming together. So, I think there's real potential for that. But but let's be honest about what's happening. The country is becoming dominated by the national political narrative, and despite the fact that this guy seems like he's not a traditional Republican, this was the first year in the history of this country in which no state voted differently for president and for United States Senate. So there's not a single state of the 33 Senate races that were up in 2016 where Donald Trump won and a Democratic Senate candidate won, or Hillary Clinton won and a Republican Senate candidate won. So, it just sort of tells you that unfortunately everything is kind of being dominated by the national partisan narrative. Maybe that runs contrary to that idea that I had, that things are going to get all screwed up, occasionally.
Yes. 2 more. And I'll have one.
I'm Barry Boyer from Worcester, Massachusetts. You were talking about the hacking of the emails. I was in a discussion yesterday with somebody who was saying, the pollsters are all looking to see where they went wrong. I'm not sure that that the pollsters were all wrong. Isn't it possible that the Russians could have also hacked the machines, the voting machines? So is it conceivable that, I'm asking him the question. Is it conceivable that we could, just as you were talking about government going more low-tech, that we could possibly go back to paper ballots throughout for federal?
So as far as I understand, there's no evidence that occurred. I can't speak to every state's system of voting, but in Connecticut, our voting is not online, and in most states, voting is not online. In Connecticut, we have paper ballots that are scanned on a machine, and then the machine is read, and that machine is not integrated into the internet. And my understanding is that most states operate in some form or fashion akin to that. So I'm going to learn to never say never when it comes to the degree to which the Russians are trying to influence American politics, but I don't think we have evidence that happened, and I think the way in which we vote probably tells you that couldn't happen for the time being. But yes, it's a caution to bring our systems of voting onto the internet before we have complete 100% certainty that can't be corrupted. I don't think we have evidence that happened.
I'm John Schlosser. As a U.S. diplomat, I served in Poland at the time of their accession to NATO. And I know my Polish friends and their Baltic neighbors are currently petrified that the United States is going to waffle on its obligations to their defense under Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And just, in a way, the damage has already been done, but I wonder what a President Trump could do to shore up confidence on the part of our NATO allies that we stand behind them.
Well, I mean, some pretty simple words about his commitment to NATO would be helpful. As you know, President Obama has been trying to do some of that on his own. To the extent that Trump's rhetoric puts pressure on the Europeans to start getting right on their defense budgets, on their ability to communicate amongst each other, on counterterrorism, that would be helpful. I mean, let's be honest. Poland is an exception of a country that is, starting to, to build up its defense infrastructure and get, to that 2% of GDP that we expect. But a lot of other countries are heading in the wrong direction. Europeans are absolutely miserable today in sharing information with each other about counterterrorism and security threats, right? The idea that they don't have a European-wide capability to track terrorists and terrorist organizations is cataclysmic to them and to us. And so we need some tough love, but we also need to say that we're going to do that within the context of, the security alliance. Here's what I worry. I mean, I worry that a bunch of big countries are going to come to this administration early on and make a deal. Say, you give us our sphere of influence, and we'll take care of some other thorny problems that we have over here, right? Russians will say, give us our sphere of influence in the Caucasus and then the Eastern Europe and the portion of the Balkans, and we'll start working with you on Syria. And the Chinese will say, you know what, we're gonna grant you some gives on trade and on currency, but just don't mess with us, when it comes to what we're doing in East Asia and Southeast Asia. I think those offers are going to come either explicitly or implicitly at some point to test this administration as to whether they're willing to make those deals. And I think that's why the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Baltics are deeply worried. I don't know what's going to happen. It may be that the administration is going to say no. I mean, you saw Putin's deputy come out the other day and, say that after the phone call that Trump had with Putin, they aren't sure what Trump's position is on Ukraine. That's, I don't know, that's like kind of good news, bad news, right? At least we're not sure. But that offer is going to come. And again, you're going to have, I don't propose to know what they're going to say, but I do know that you're going to have Republicans and Democrats in Congress telling this administration to reject those deals. And there are certainly names that have been floated for Secretary of State who would counsel the president to reject those deals, right? There are thoughtful Republicans that know that those are bad offers. And we hope that those are the folks that end up populating these departments.
I told Senator Murphy that I'd ask one final question, but I'm actually going to ask two because we haven't heard about Mexico. They're both related to globalization. So first, if Trump were to do what he says he might do and increase tariffs and rip up or alter trade agreements like NAFTA, he might actually resuscitate an immigration problem that he's trying to control. If Mexico falls into a depression or a Great Recession, more people will come this way. So that's the first question. The second question goes to something that Bernie Sanders recently said, which was Democrats in this election did not find the way, the elites did not find a way to talk to working class Democrats. So we thought the Republican Party was going to die, at least that's what columnists said. It looks like the Democrats have this communication problem, at least.
Yeah. No, I think you're right to sort of pose this tension that's going to exist with NAFTA and U.S.-Mexico policy. And again, it's impossible to, it's sort of back in a position of trying to predict what he's going to do. Listen, I'm a big critic of these trade deals. I do not think they've worked for us, and I think we categorize them in terms of the total. The big corporations tell us that NAFTA worked because the overall flow of the economy has technically worked to the benefit of the United States, but nobody actually goes in and shows the jobs numbers where I would tell you that we have absolutely lost jobs as a result of NAFTA, and I admit that there's a flow of globalization happening that is inevitable, but you don't need to expedite it in a way that is done prior to our ability to retrain those workers for the jobs of the new economy here in the United States. And so I don't have any problem trying to go in and renegotiate the terms of these agreements. I don't have any problem with being a little bit tougher on China when it comes to the ways in which that they have violated the traditional norms of trade. I do think you have to pace it in a way that doesn't crater those economies such that we create bigger problems than we think that we're solving. On the second point, yeah, so that's what we're all spending our time talking about today. I am not in the camp of those who think that this is a moment of existential crisis for the Democratic Party. We still won the popular vote by a daily increasing margin, and we increased the number of seats that we have in the Senate and the House. Now, we didn't win back those chambers. We didn't win the Electoral College, but this was not a 1980 or a 1984 election for the Democratic Party. I mean, what we had was the ability to convince working class voters, maybe segmented to white working class voters, that we were for them, but we didn't try. Why? Because we got sort of sucked in to Donald Trump, and we created a frame that was Donald Trump is dangerous and reckless, and Hillary Clinton is ready, right? That was essentially the Democratic frame. His frame was that the economy is rigged, and she helped rig it, and I'll help unrig it, right? So we didn't really even attempt to litigate the election on that economic frame that mattered to working class voters. And my argument is that we don't have to reshape what we're for as a party. We're actually for the things that will help those voters, right? Continuing to hold Wall Street accountable, raising the minimum wage, making college radically more affordable, concentrating tax cuts on those voters rather than on the rich. We just have to actually make that the frame when we walk into elections, and we haven't. And the second thing I'll say about it is that, in general, our party has been addicted to incrementalism, and the Republican Party has been much more attracted to big, nasty ideas, and we've got to have some big, nasty ideas on our side as well. And so the idea that, like, my party spent 4 years talking about lowering.
Nasty's a strange word.
Yeah, right. I know. My party's been addicted to talking about, or concentrated on talking about, lowering the interest rate on student loans. I'm sorry, but that doesn't do it for people, right? The idea that they're going to still have to borrow the same amount of money and they'll just pay a lower interest rate, that is not like fundamentally changing the world for kids that graduate with $200,000 worth of loans. It helps, right? I mean, it helps. But we do have to listen to Bernie and think about ways to talk about free college, right? Just saying, you know what? We made a commitment to people 70 years ago that you were going to get enough free public education to allow you to compete in a global economy. 70 years ago, that was 12th grade. Today, that's 16th grade. And so let's just apply the same premise and say you are going to get enough free education to allow you to compete in a global economy. And today, that's college. And I'm not saying you got to pay for Yale, but you should at least pay for Gateway Community College or Eastern Connecticut State University. We've got to get back to the idea of putting some big ideas on the table. That's what people want to hear. And then we've got to get back to the frame that is the frame that matters for swing voters, and not get sucked into the frame that the person we're running against might frankly want us to get sucked into. And if we do that, then I think we can turn popular vote majorities into electoral vote majorities. And here, can I say one last thing?
Absolutely.
It's that I also don't want our party to get to be concentrated only on that question of what wins the next election, right? We do have an obligation to try to be a responsible minority party and to find ways where we can govern with the new president and with his cabinet when we can, and to fight him like hell when we have to. And I think that needs to be, I don't want to fall into the mistake that I would argue Republicans made, in which they came out after Barack Obama's election and said, our number one goal is to make sure that this guy loses 4 years from now. I want Donald Trump to lose 4 years from now, right? Everybody knows that I want that. Everybody knows that Chuck Schumer wants that, but we don't have to have that as our daily guiding principle. We can try to find ways to work together, try to find ways to educate this administration on these matters of foreign policy in which there is an education happening, and we will have plenty of time to fight the fights that matter and to worry about the next election.
Well, we are all election weary, that's for sure. So I hope that Senator Schumer and his counterpart will talk the way Senator Mitchell and Bob Dole did. We heard about that at our opening dinner, and at least have a dialogue and to disagree sensibly, civilly. Thank you for being with us. Please stay for an announcement, but let's applaud the senator. Senator Murphy, thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.